Good morning, all. My name is B. Santhosh Kumar, Assistant Professor, Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. My subject is Computer Architecture. Today I am discussing about input or output interface. Input or output organization. Input or output organization of computer depends upon the size of the computer and the peripherals connected to it. The input-output subsystem of a computer, referred to as input-output, provides an efficient mode of communication between the central system and the outside environment. Input or output devices attached to the computer are also called peripherals. Suppose we are taking any of the CPU, definitely we have to connect input and output for this one. So what are the inputs and outputs we are connecting? Those we are calling as a peripherals. So what are the peripherals means? So peripherals means externally connected. Externally connected devices. So peripherals means externally connected devices. Those are we are calling as a peripherals. So input and outputs of the CPU are called peripherals. So what are the inputs here? Suppose I am taking keyboard, mouse. So outputs are printer, speaker, and here touch screens. Here also touch screen, joystick. So these are the keyboard, mouse, touch screen, joystick, printer, speaker. So these are the inputs and outputs of the CPU. So we are connected externally to the CPU. Those are called peripherals. So peripherals means externally connected devices to the CPU. That is called peripherals. So the input-output organization of a computer depends upon the size of the computer and the peripherals connected to it. So the input-output subsystem of a computer, referred to as I by O, means input output or output, provides an efficient mode of communication between the central system and the outside environment. So outside environment to the, suppose we are connected input, that is the outside to CPU. Suppose output means CPU to outside environment. So the central system of the outside environment. Input or output devices attached to the computer are also called peripherals. So what are the inputs and outputs are connected to the CPU? Those are we are calling as a peripherals. So these peripheral devices, input output devices attached to the computer are called peripherals. So what are the peripherals? There are two types of peripherals: input devices connected and output devices connected to the CPU. So what are the input devices of the peripherals to the connected to the CPU? Keyboard, that is one thing, and optical input devices. So what are the optical input devices? These are the second one. So card reader, barcode reader, digitizer, optical mark reader, screen input devices, touch screen, light pen, mouse, and trackball, joystick, microphones, webcams. So these are the input peripherals. Input devices are peripherals which are externally connected to CPU. And what are the output devices? So CRT, cathode ray tube, and printers. In the printer, impact, inkjet, laser, matrix. There are different types of printers, but finally we are calling it is a printer. And CRT, speaker and monitor. So third one is speaker and fourth monitor. These are some examples. So these are the output devices or peripherals which are externally connected to CPU. So, what are the peripheral devices? We are dividing as a two input devices or input peripherals and output peripherals. So, keyboard, card reader, barcode, digitizer, optical mark, touchscreen, light pen, mouse, trackball, joystick, microphones, and webcams are the input devices. And output devices means CRT, cathode ray tube, printer, speaker, monitor. These are the output devices. So the input and output devices that communicate with the people and the computer are usually involved in the transfer of alphanumeric information to and from the device, and the computer is ASCII, American Standard Code for Information Interchange. ASCII is a 7-bit code, but most computers manipulate an 8-bit quantity as a single unit called a byte. Therefore, ASCII characters most often are stored 1 per byte. So in the open input output devices that communicate with people and the computer are usually involved in the transfer of alphanumeric information, and from the device of the computer are ASCII, American Standard Code information. So what are the communication people with people and the computer? People and the computer. So we are defining with ASCII, American Standard Code for Information Interchange between the people and the computer. So ASCII is a 7-bit code, but most computers manipulate 8-bit quantity as a single unit called a byte. Therefore, ASCII character most often are stored 1 per byte. So, input and output peripherals communicate with people and computer. Communicate with people and computer. So, this is a we are defining as a 7-bit, or we are taking as a manipulate 8-bit quantity as a single unit called a byte. So, these are the some examples of decimal from 0 to 10, hexadecimal, and name. Suppose I'm taking decimal is 0, hexa is 0, the character name is null, character is null, null. These are the some instructions are there. Control at the rate, and 1 decimal is 1 and hexadecimal is 1. The meaning start of heading SCH, start of heading SOH. That is a control A, and decimal number is 3, hexadecimal 3, that is end of text, that is ETX, end of limit, that is EOT, inquiry, ENQ, acknowledge, ACK, bell, BEL, backspace, BS, horizontal, line, vertical. So these are the device control 1, these are the important one, device control 1, device control 2, device control 3, and device control 4. So that is I'm taking as a device control 1, DC1, DC2, DC3, DC4. Here control Q, R, S, T, and these are the very very important. And if you are going for the cancel of this one, CAN, and file separator FS. So these are some instructions or shortcuts for keyboard to CPU, but we are taking with hexadecimal and decimal in the language. So these are also called ASCII numbers, and these are from decimal 0 to for total 127 means 128 are there, 0 to 127, total 128 characters are there with ASCII. These are the shortcuts for this one. So I'm taking as here some space and some special characters, symbols, and 0 to 9, and less than or equal to like this, and capital letters A, B, C, D, F, G, H up to Z. So these are small letters A, B, C, D, F, G, H up to Z. So delete option. So there are different text, letters, special characters, symbols, all are included. That is a 0 to 127. Total 128 characters are there with the ASCII. And so these 128 characters or 128 symbols. So these 128 characters are included text, special functions, and special characters, alphabets, and numbers, etc. So these are the some special characters, symbols, and control input output controlling devices, and numbers in small letters, capital letters, and special characters, special numbers like this. So input output interface. Input output interface provides a method for transferring information between internal storage such as memory and CPU registers and external input output devices. So input output interface provides a method for transferring information between internal storage such as memory and CPU. So between the memory and CPU. So inputs and outputs. So these are interfacing. Definitely inputs and outputs are the interface for CPU. So these are transferring information between the internal storage such as memory and CPU registers and external input output devices. Peripherals connected to a computer need special communication links or interface unit for interfacing them with the central processing unit. So what are the peripherals are there? What we are connecting input output to the CPU? Those are the peripherals connected to a computer need special communication links or interface unit for interfacing them with the central processing unit. So what are the peripherals are there? We are connected to CPU or from CPU of the input outputs. The purpose of the communication links or interface unit is to resolve the difference that exists between the central computer and each peripheral. The major differences are the nature of peripheral device is electromagnetic and electromechanical. The nature of the CPU is electronic. There is a lot of difference in the mode of operation of both the peripheral devices and CPU. The data transfer rate of peripherals is usually slower than the transfer rate of the CPU, and consequently a synchronization mechanism may be needed. Data code and formats and peripheral differ from the word format in the CPU and memory. The operating modes of peripherals are different from each other and each must be controlled so as not to disturb the operation of other peripherals connected to the CPU. So what is the first point now? The purpose of the communication links or interface unit is to resolve the differences that exist between the central computer and each peripheral. The major differences are, suppose if you are connecting CPU with input and output, so the nature of peripheral devices are electromagnetic and electromechanical. The nature of the CPU is electronic. There is a lot of difference of the mode of operation for both the peripheral devices and CPU. So what are the input devices and output devices are there? So we are connecting as a peripherals. So these peripherals, the data transfer rate of peripherals is usually slower than the transfer rate of the CPU. So what is the data transfer of CPU? Is very high. And what are the peripherals are there? Input or output? These are the peripherals, and these data rates are very low. So what are the input and outputs are there? These input and output are peripherals connected to the CPU. So the data rate or data transfer is very high in the CPU and the very low in the input output devices. So inputs and outputs, what do we see? It is a data transfer. data transfer to input to CPU. Here data transfer CPU to output. So what are the data transfer? That is the rate peripherals is usually slower than the rate of the CPU and synchronization mechanism may be needed. So what is the data transfer to input and the data transfer to output? Definitely it is a synchronization. We need a synchronization with clock pulse. With clock also we need. So the input and output devices or the peripherals are connected to the CPU. Definitely the data transfer rate is very high in the CPU, and compared to CPU the data transfer is very low at the peripheral or input output. So it is a synchronization mechanism. So when the synchronization is started, the clock pulse is applied to the synchronization between the input to the CPU and CPU to the output. So the data code or formats of peripheral differ from the word format in the CPU and memory. So what is the data transfer? So what is the data transfer we are applied? That is I'm taking as a this data transfer I'm taking as a data codes. So data codes and formats in peripherals differ from the word format in the CPU and memory. The operating modes of peripherals and different from each other, and each must be controlled so as not to disturb the operation of other peripheral connected to the CPU. So what are the data codes are there in the peripherals? Those are differ from the CPU to others, and CPU to memory also. And these operating modes of peripherals are differ from each other, and each must be controlled so as not to disturb the operation of the peripherals connected to the CPU. So input-output interface. To resolve these differences, computer system is include special hardware components between the CPU and peripherals to supervises and synchronizes all the input and output transfers. These components are called interface units because the interface between the processor bus and the peripheral devices. So input and output interfacing. To resolve these differences, computer system include special hardware components between the CPU and peripherals to supervises and synchronizes all the input and output transfers. These components are called interface units because the interface between the processor and peripheral devices. So what I'm taking the CPU from input to output. So the computer system includes special hardware components between the CPU and hardware. Those are the special hardware special hardware components between CPU and peripherals to supervises and synchronizes all the input and output. So synchronization means the data transfer between the input to CPU and CPU to the output with a specific clock pulse. And these components are called interface units because they interface between the processor bus and the peripheral devices. So processor bus means it is a data bus or address bus or data transferring between the input to CPU and CPU to output. So processor bus and peripheral devices are must and should connected to transferring the data from input to output. So it is a block diagram of input output interfacing. So it is between the CPU and memory. So if we are connecting between the CPU and memory, what are the connections are there? So first connection is a input output bus, that is a address bus, data bus and control bus. So CPU to memory, three buses are connected. Three buses are connected. That is a address bus, data bus and control bus. So between this line is address, data and control. These are interfaces. Address, data and control, these are one interfacing. Address, data, control, it is one interfacing. So interfacing is nothing but the connection between the CPU and input output. So it is a interfacing means externally connected. Externally connected. So what are the externally connected devices? So externally connected devices. So how many are there? Interface 1, interface 2 and interface 3. So first interfacing is the monitor, second interfacing is a keyboard, third interfacing is a hard disk. So these are the interfacing between input and output. Monitor is a output, so maybe, and keyboard is a input, and a hard disk also a input or output, working as a input and output. So these are the interface between the CPU and memory with address, data and control buses. And there are so many interfacings are there, but here we are taking some example of three interfacings. And monitor, keyboard, hard disk are connected to the CPU and memory with through the buses. So each peripheral device has associated with it an interface unit. Each interface decodes the address and control, receives from the input output bus, and interprets them for peripheral and provides signal for the peripheral controller. It also synchronizes the data flow and supervises the transfer between peripherals and processor. To communicate with a particular device, the processor places a device address on the address lines. Each interface attached to the input-output bus contains an address decoder that monitors the address lines. When the interface detects its own address, it activates the path between the bus lines and the device that it controls. All peripherals whose address does not correspond to that address in the bus are disabled the interface. So go to first point. Each peripheral device is associated with an interfacing unit. So each of each of the interface device is connected, associated with the interface unit. Each interface decodes the address and control, receives from the input output bus, interprets for the peripheral and provides signals for the peripheral controller. It also synchronizes the data flow and supervises the transfer between peripherals and processor. And the data flow between the interfacing and CPU to memory. The transfer is between the CPU to memory through the interfacing devices. So that is a data transfer with synchronization. And to communicate with a particular device, the processor places a device address on the address line. So any of the processor, we need address bus, data bus and control bus also. And these address lines are interfaces with input output bus and contains the address decoder that monitors the address lines. When the interface detects its own address and it activates a path between the bus lines and the device that the control, all peripherals whose address with decoding and does not correspond to address of the bus and disabled with the interfacing. So what are the functions of input output interfacing? It is used to synchronize the operating speed of the CPU with respect to input output. So synchronization is in between the input to output to what is the synchronization means? For the data transfer between the input and output. It selects the input output device which is appropriate for the interpretation of the input output device, and it is capable of providing signals like control and timing signals. So when we are synchronizing, we need a control signal, and this is the data buffering can be possible through the data bus. So input to CPU and CPU output, definitely we need a data buffering, but that means data transfer. And there are various error detections are there. It converts serial data into parallel data and vice versa, and it also converts digital data into analog and analog to digital, vice versa. It converts serial to parallel. So when I'm giving input is serial, but output may be parallel connections are there, and converts the digital data into a analog. Means the data is in the CPU, maybe the data is a digital form. Suppose I need a printer, so digital to analog. So a printer is a analog hard copy. So digital is a soft copy, soft to hard, maybe it is a digital to analog. So these are the references of this one. So today we discussed input output interfacings. So in the input output interfacing, it is a synchronization is possible with the computer, that is depends on the size of the computer and the peripherals connected to it. The input output subsystem of a computer, referred to as input output, provides an efficient mode of communication between CPU and the outside environment. Input output devices attached to the computer are also called the peripherals. So what are the input and output connections are there? These input and outputs we are calling as a peripherals. So in the peripherals, we need input-output subsystem computer referred to as input-output provides efficient mode of communication between the central system and the outside environment. Input-output devices attached to the computer are also called peripherals. So, input-output devices attached to the computer are peripheral. So, what are the input-outputs? Are we are calling as a peripherals. So, input devices are input peripherals, output peripherals. So, keyboard, card reader, barcode, digitizer, optical mark reader, touchscreen, light pen, mouse, trackball, joystick, microphone, webcams. These are the input devices connected to the CPU. And what are the output peripherals? Cathode ray tube CRT, printer, and speaker, monitor. These are the output devices connected to the CPU, connected from the CPU. And input output devices that communicate with people and computer are usually involved in the transfer of alphanumeric information and from the devices of the computer in ASCII. And ASCII is a 7-bit code, but most computers are manipulating with 8-bit quantity as a transferring the data with a byte. So people and computer can understand with ASCII. People means even high level languages. So people means high level languages to computer and computer to high level languages. ASCII code is used to converting from computer language to people understanding and people to computer understanding language. But it is a 7-bit ASCII, but most probably we are using 8-bit quantity with a single unit is called byte. And these are the special characters of null and special characters, hexadecimal characters. So I'm taking decimal and hexa 0 to 127 or 128 characters are there. Char null, null means null, start of heading, start of text, and end of text, end of limit, and inquiry, acknowledge. So these are the data line escape, device control 1, device control 2, device control 3, device control 4, DC1, DC2, DC3, DC4. So like this. And we are going for the numbers and special symbols and special characters and alphabetical numbers and capital letters and small letters. So these are the 128 characters are discussed in input output interfacing. We are using through the keyboard to CPU. And input output interfacings are the method for transferring information between the internal storage such as memory and CPU registers and external input output devices. So peripherals connected to your computer need special communication links or interface unit for interfacing them with the central processing unit. So what is the internal storage such as memory and CPU? So CPU and memory are internally connected. So for this we need input to output connections are there. So we need peripherals for this and peripherals connected to computer to special communication links or interface unit with interfacing them with central processing unit. So the nature of the peripheral devices are electromagnetic or electromechanical with peripheral devices and CPU. The data transfer rate of peripherals usually slower than the transfer rate of CPU and consequently synchronization mechanism may be needed. Data codes and formats in peripheral differ from the word format in the CPU. The operating mode of peripherals are different from each other and each must be controlled and do not disturb the operation of the peripherals connected to the CPU. So definitely the peripherals are connected to the CPU with memory and input-output interfaces that between the CPU and peripherals are supervised and synchronization is possible with all input-output processors. These components are called interface unit because they interface between the processor, bus and the peripheral devices. So what are the CPU and memory? So there are the three buses are there: address bus, data bus and control bus with interfaces. There are so many interfaces are there. Here I'm taking example interface 1, interface 2 and interface 3 with a monitor, keyboard and a hard disk. So these are the connection between the CPU and memory is the three buses: address bus, data bus and control bus. And these buses are connected with externally connected devices that is interfacing with input and output. So each peripheral device associated with interface unit. Each interface decodes the address and control received from the input output bus and interprets them for the peripherals and provides signal for the peripheral. The synchronization is possible with the data flow of supervisors with input and outputs. To communicate with a particular device, the processor places a device address on the address lines. So, what are the functions? First function, to synchronizing the operating speed of the CPU with respect to input and output. To select input output device which appropriate for the interpretation of the input output device, and means first synchronization is possible, and input output devices are definitely appropriate with the input output devices and capable of providing signals like control and timing signals. Why I am going for the control and timing signals means here the control bus data and address buses are there. So address data are must be between the input and outputs. So how we are controlling means through the control signals. So we need a control signal like a control and timing signals, and the data buffering means the data transferring from input to CPU and the CPU to CPU from the CPU to output. And there are various error detectors are there. Maybe error detections and corrections will be there. Maybe, and it converts the serial data to the parallel data. Input is always serial, and the output is maybe parallel data will be there. And it also converts digital data into the analog. Suppose I have one image is there, that image is in a digital form. I have to take the print through the printer. I will take print. So this print is analog or not? As this image is a analog. So it is a digital to analog conversion. So these are the references of input output interfacing. Okay, thank you.
Like, share and subscribe. Hit the bell icon for more updates.